Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the second episode of Rpgibberish. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for listening to the first episode and responding with comments and leaving feedback. We're very grateful for that, and we'll definitely work in all the tips that you've been giving us. But for now, we are moving on to the second episode, and in this episode, we are going to be talking about another fantastic RPG company, and that is Mistwalker. Mistwalker is, of course, a fantastic company that kind of spawned off from a lot of the creators of the Final Fantasy and Squaresoft era. But we'll talk about that in a second. First of all, Greg, how have you been doing?
How you going, Nero? I've been doing very well. I've actually been busy lately with my channels. I recently hit 600 subscribers with my RPG Swagman channel, and I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you to all my subscribers. It's been um, an awesome year since September of last year. I've met a lot of new friends and talked to a lot of great gamers. So I'd like to say thank you so much. And I opened a new channel which is under the name of Kojima Collector, where I talk about Metal Gear Solid and other games that Hideo Kojima has made, which is really cool. And pretty much I haven't been gaming a lot lately. I'll get into that later in the podcast. How about you? How have you been doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fine, and I definitely want to mention for everybody out there, definitely check out Kojima Collector. Greg has made a couple of great videos talking about Metal Gear Solid and Kojima. I'm a big fan, of course, as well, so I had to subscribe to that. But yeah, I've been doing very well. One minor thing, I started a new job assignment, which allows me to travel a very long time. But with my PSP, I've been playing a lot of RPGs, pretty much 3 hours a day.
Oh, that's good. Well, I'm glad that I'm glad for the existence of the PSP because that's probably what it was kind of made for. I hear so many stories of Japanese businessmen on those trains and bullet trains just with their PSP. I just reckon it's the DS and the PSP are just two of the most superb handhelds out there. That kind of they are it can be played by any gamer depending on where you are. Of course, there's the different games for each system that sort of complements to play it on the run or to crash on your couch or merge into your bed. Just a great selection of titles, and I often actually play my PSP on the bus, and I know the feeling of playing on the run. It's very daunting at first, but you kind of get used to it, especially if you've got a busy job and you just need as much time as you could possibly can to play a game.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can definitely use that time. I'm making 55 to 60 hour shifts, but with the travel time and the time I have playing there, I can get a lot of RPG time going, which we'll of course talk about later on with the weekly challenge. So yeah, I think it's time to start. On the Mistwalker segment. And as we've mentioned before in the first episode of RP Gibberish, we take a specific series or a specific company and we just discuss the entire history, how we like the games, future of the company, etc. And for this episode, it's Mistwalker. So I'm going to be starting off, talking a little bit about Mistwalker itself. Now, Mistwalker was founded back in 2004. Officially, it's called Mistwalker Corporation, and the studio was founded by, of course, the one and only Hironobu Sakaguchi, which is, of course, the creator of the Final Fantasy series. At some point, Enix took over Square, and there were a lot of key figures not very happy with their position. And for most notably, of course, Hironobu Sakaguchi, who at that time lost a lot of face at Square for the failure of the animated movie Spirits Within. He kind of loosened himself from Square and moved on to Mistwalker. And the thing with Mistwalker is Microsoft was looking for a lot of Japanese companies, especially RPG companies, to start on working on games, exclusive games for the Xbox and the upcoming Xbox 360. So with a lot of financial backing from Microsoft, Hironobu Sakaguchi and several others were able to found Mistwalker and start developing games exclusively for the 360, which in the earlier years led to two fantastic titles we'll talk in a second. But eventually, Microsoft lost their exclusivity, and Mistwalker has been developing a lot of different games. As of now, they have released three major titles that have or are going to be released in the European and North American regions as well. And they definitely made a lot of handheld games as well, and specifically the Nintendo DS, where they usually outsourced or co-developed with several other companies, which we'll talk about later on. So that's pretty much the history of Mistwalker. You know, not a lot of great games, but in the last 7 years, they've made some very interesting RPGs. Of course, it is very hard for them to lose the face, you know, of being a Square company. We have Hironobu Sakaguchi. In terms of the musical department, they asked Nobuo Uematsu himself to make the wonderful soundtracks to the games. And there are more developers, you know, from the Square era. So it's really hard for Mistwalker to kind of lose themselves of that Square stigma. Several people have also called them, you know, just copying, but that's really hard to do, you know. I feel honestly that the Mistwalker games are indeed very similar to Final Fantasy, especially Lost Odyssey. And if you look at the title of course, their Wii title, you know, the last story kind of ties into Final Fantasy. I personally really don't mind the games being similar to the series that I love the most. I don't know, Greg, how do you feel about Mistwalker stigma, you know, towards Square?
I don't look at it too much, but what I basically how I came into Mistwalker was it has to do with my extreme dislike of Final Fantasy X-2. I hated their game so much. I kind of researched into things to know what went wrong, and found out that most of the key figures did not work on that game, and they left around that time. So I thought to myself, I wanted to play the next big adventure after FF10, which I really loved actually, and I found out that they started this company. So I kind of put two and two together. I was wondering if they were going to kind of touch into the magic that they provided Square with the early Final Fantasy titles. So I was really on board, but not to begin with, because I saw Blue Dragon, and while it looked interesting, it wasn't really a game that really attracted me at first. But when I saw Lost Odyssey, I got the same sixth sense that I did with Final Fantasy VII, and I said that this game was going to be special, and I actually did buy a 360 just to play Lost Odyssey. Now, as for the stigma that it gets, well, of course, the company's head by Hironobu Sakaguchi, and then it's got music by the wonderful Nobuo Uematsu. So, of course, fans are going to make that assumption that they're going to try and tap into how they made the games back in the day. But I don't want to say the word stigma too much. It's just they both have a style of making games, and it's very apparent. And to be perfectly honest, there's nothing wrong with it, because what they provide to their games. They're just Hironobu Sakaguchi is such a wonderful director. He provides um, every game he makes is just, there's something about it that just makes you sit down and just lose yourself from start to finish. And of course, the same goes with Nobuo Uematsu's music. You can just listen to that for hours and just lose yourself in a whole nother place. So I don't really like to say the stigma, but I can understand where you're going with that. It just doesn't really bother me that much. I love what they do, and I don't try to look too much into it with comparing it to the original Final Fantasy series.
All right, yeah, it's something that I've known a lot of people are talking about, and I thought it just would be an interesting topic to talk about. Personally, of course, I don't mind it, but I feel, you know, that with this current age of gaming, you know, a lot of people are very quickly to point out, you know, copycat here, copycat there, and yeah, it's something that Mistwalker will probably always have with it, because, you know, most of the team is comprised of earlier Final Fantasy and Square persons.
One thing I want to touch upon, what might seem as copycat to one player may seem as fresh and new to someone else. Of course, the way how an industry evolves, this is not just for gaming, but also for movies and any other industry, is someone will always inspire someone else to do something, and that person will loosely base his or her ideas off what they love. And like I said before, if they're good at telling a story a certain way, then I'm not going to criticize them for, if they've tapped into like an earlier source or they tapped into an earlier work they did, that's fine with me. Especially with the Mistwalker games, I absolutely love them because they do have some similarities, but it's packaged in a way that makes them kind of fresh and new in my eyes, at least. I just wanted to touch upon that for a couple of seconds.
Oh yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I feel the same way. With video games, movies, and such. So yeah, that's definitely the way I feel as well. All right, I think that's about it for the Mistwalker history. So let's begin with the first games of Mistwalker. The first game that they developed, of course, exclusive for the Xbox 360, was Blue Dragon. Now, I've played this game from start to finish, and I even went as far as getting all the achievements in the game. But Greg, I believe you have not played Blue Dragon.
I have not played the full game. I actually played the demo, but what's really funny is I actually gave my Xbox 360 away, and this was before I became a really hardcore collector. Before I made the vow to collect every RPG. It wasn't until years later that I found Blue Dragon in a bargain bin, and I bought it for like $20. And for all of you that don't know how outrageous Australian prices are, a new release 360 game can range from about $80 to $100. So $20 is nothing. It's incredibly cheap. So I didn't think twice about fishing it out and paid for it. But just quickly, my experiences with the demo. Of course, I could hear the wonderful score by Nobuo Uematsu. But of course, the one thing that really surprised me, of course, is the artwork by the renowned Akira Toriyama. And I'm a big fan of his work, not for DBZ mainly, but for his work on Dragon Quest, which I think he's created some of the best characters in that series. And I got to say, my first initial thoughts was it's very childlike in terms of design, but I really like the one thing that sticks out with Blue Dragon is the fact that they control these shadows in battle. That's how they attack. That's their abilities. That's how sort of it runs, and that's the main focus that interests me. Now, I didn't mind what I played of the demo, but I definitely want to pass final judgment until I've played the game in full.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've played the demo myself before I picked it up. I wouldn't say that I bought a 360 exclusively for this, but Blue Dragon, it definitely was my first RPG on any of the current gen consoles. So that holds that specific award already. But judging on Blue Dragon, I absolutely loved it. Back in 2007, I was kind of getting into becoming a real RPG collector, and to play a brand new RPG, I really enjoyed it. Let's see, with Blue Dragon, I haven't played the Dragon Quest games all that much. Akira Toriyama, his artwork wasn't known to me except for Dragon Ball Z, of course. But overall, Blue Dragon is indeed a fantastic turn-based RPG that you indeed control the shadows of the different characters, and I really enjoyed it. It is very childlike. It is very easy on the eyes. It's definitely aimed towards a younger group of characters. But overall, I still really enjoyed it. The game itself is about 50 to 60 hours long, and in those 50 to 60 hours, I was able to get every achievement in the game, which basically requires you to become level 100 and learn all spells. But overall, the gameplay is definitely very charming. With controlling the shadows, it still is a traditional turn-based RPG, and with the With the gameplay, you have a lot of standard skills that we all grown to love, in RPGs, different magic spells and limit breaks and such. So the gameplay system didn't really do anything new, but all the elements tied together, with the presentation, the new at that time, of course, graphics. It was one of the first really HD games. I absolutely loved it. In terms of story, it opens up really easy. With several characters in a town being attacked, them awakening their shadows, and eventually, it starts off to become a much greater and richer experience for the main characters, and we meet a lot more playable characters later on. But overall, I really enjoyed Blue Dragon for what it is. It's a great, charming RPG, definitely heightened by the great artwork of Akira Toriyama, the fantastic music by Nobuo Uematsu, and yeah, it just had a specific charm and appeal to it that just kept me going for hours and hours. And I absolutely love the game, and I can definitely recommend it. I know it's not a short game, but definitely check it out. And what I do know is that Blue Dragon is definitely one of the cheaper games and RPGs that you can find on a 360. So yeah, that's pretty much it on Blue Dragon. However, Blue Dragon on its own has become somewhat of a franchise and phenomenon, which kind of surprised me. Once Blue Dragon hit, I was thought I was done with it, and I was hoping that at some point we might see a Blue Dragon 2 sequel, which honestly was in the works, or at least was mentioned for a very long time. And eventually, what Mistwalker did is they made not one but two Nintendo DS titles in the Blue Dragon series. First of all, there was Blue Dragon Plus, which they co-developed with Brownie Brown, a studio who's also responsible for Mother 3. But Blue Dragon Plus changed it all up. It wasn't a turn-based RPG, it was more a strategy, real-time RPG, which felt kind of similar at that time to Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings.
I was going to say that was a common thing for DS games. Of course, they also had Heroes of Mana. They like to produce these real-time strategy games, and I just saw some similarities around that time when I saw Heroes of Mana, Revenant Wings, and now Blue Dragon. So it was kind of this subgenre that was just getting some screen time. At least I think I played a bit of Heroes of Mana, but that's another time. But I was very surprised that Mistwalker went that route with the Blue Dragon series. I commonly see them on the shelves, but I have not yet picked them up. I will definitely have to get them when I beat Blue Dragon.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's something I wanted to mention. I know that Blue Dragon Plus can be found for relatively cheap, but I haven't run into it for a really low price as well. So I haven't checked it out yet, except for some gameplay. Now that game was released in 2008. 2 years after Blue Dragon. And a couple of years later, 2 years later, they released Blue Dragon Awakened Shadow, which again is a spin-off which takes place 2 years after the original Blue Dragon. And the funny thing about this one is that it's been co-developed by Crescendo. And Crescendo, as again a company with a very rich history, will delve into its own episode. They're most notably known for, Eternal Sonata and several others. But overall, Awakened Shadow was another different game in the series. This time the gameplay is more of an action RPG. So with three games in the series, we have a turn-based one, we have a sort of a strategy RPG, and then we have a action RPG. They're very diverse gameplay, and to be honest, if I have to pick one of them, I'm the most intrigued in Awakened Shadow than Blue Dragon Plus, but I will definitely try to check them out at some point. The interesting thing, of course, about Awakened Shadow is that you're able to create your own character, and you kind of run into other characters, especially the characters from the first Blue Dragon. So that's basically the history of Blue Dragon with the games. However, it became a franchise on its own. Basically, what happened is Namco Bandai kind of took the license and also created a anime series of the Blue Dragon series. And I'm a big fan of anime as well. And I remember watching the Blue Dragon anime with my friends, and I just got really, really frustrated. They took a lot of liberties with the source material, and I just was amazed how they could mess up such a great story from Blue Dragon. It was almost nothing like the first game. It was basically you saw the characters, but they had a different different background all of a sudden, different characters, bad guys, and I personally believe that anime series kind of made me pretty pissed off at how they messed up the series, and that's also probably why I haven't really delved into the games on the Nintendo DS. I haven't played them, and I will hope to get around to them eventually. But just overall, Blue Dragon on the Xbox 360 is a very interesting RPG. It might not be very revolutionary, especially in terms of story and content, but it is a very charming RPG. Uh, and if you're a big fan of most notably Dragon Quest, which kind of has the same style, of course, same art style, I can definitely recommend Blue Dragon. And it's definitely it was my first, and it's definitely one of the most enjoyable RPGs on the 360. So Greg, I definitely hope that you are able to get around to that eventually.
I absolutely will. Once I get a 360, that's going to be one of the first games I'm going to play.
Yeah, I can definitely recommend most RPGs. Blue Dragon is one, and of course the fantastic Tales of Vesperia, which we'll talk about way more later on. So yeah, I think that about wraps up the entire history of Blue Dragon. If you're interested in Blue Dragon and you're looking for an Xbox 360 RPG, definitely check it out. So yeah, let's move on to the next game, which was released a year after that, and that is Lost Odyssey. Again, I personally played it, and I absolutely loved it. I did break up, my playthrough with a couple of months, but eventually I was able to beat it, and again got all the achievements for it. But I know Greg has played Lost Odyssey as well, so I'm going to give him the floor. Please tell us about Lost Odyssey.
Okay, Lost Odyssey is this incredible masterpiece, of course, created by the wonderful developers at Mistwalker. This game, when I saw the trailer, I went out and bought an Xbox 360 because there was something about it that gave me this sixth sense. And it's usually for some games that I kind of look at and think there's going to be special. And I had the sixth sense when I looked at Final Fantasy VII, when I looked at Shining Force 2 and Suikoden 2. Just these games I just think has something about them that will lead to greatness. And Lost Odyssey has that in spades. There's just so much to love about the game. The visuals, I thought at the time, were the best I've ever seen in a game. It really utilizes the 360s graphics to the limit, and I just thought it was an absolute gorgeous visual masterpiece. And of course, the soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu was just, oh, it was just as good as his previous Final Fantasy games. It's just as good, if not. Actually, I'm gonna go out and say that it actually Lost Odyssey has my favorite battle theme of all time. I can listen to that for ages, and whenever I got into the battle, I was always felt like it was a treat to hear that every time. And I always want to do a video where I talk about my 10 most favorite video game battle themes, but right there, I've already given you the top number one of all time. It is Lost Odyssey's battle theme. But of course, the story and the characters were just, I connected with them immediately. Now, one of the things that I got to say that kind of just astounded me when I played Lost Odyssey is booting it up for the first time and seeing that wonderful epic intro. And in the back of my mind, all I can say is, oh, this is just an FMV. This is a pre-made video. And I'm watching the main character, Kaim, and this amazing battle between the armies of Uhura and Kent. and it was just so mesmerizing. And then to see the main character Kime come in into the fray and take on the soldiers of Kent was amazing. But oh my god, when I saw the battle transition from the FMV was so flawless, I was absolutely I was shocked. I just thought there and there, we're now in the future of RPGs. You know, just the quality, it just really upped the ante with quality in the games. And when the command window appeared, there was no difference between the FMV and the in-game footage. It's just that good. And it was done in a way to really shock the player. And it was an epic intro that kind of really introduced Kime as this powerful warrior beyond everything else. And then you learn very quickly in the storyline that Kime is an immortal. He's lived for more than 1,000 years. And throughout the journey, you learn about, you know, what's happened to him in many different ways, but a lot of people now I just want to get into quickly one of the most controversial parts of Lost Odyssey that a lot of people disliked. I personally loved it. Anyone who reads books can get into it. People that don't like reading books probably will get alienated, and that is they have Kime has these 1,000 years of dreams section of the game where just text appears on the screen, but all the transitions of text is done in this wonderful special effects that's very spellbinding. And to be perfectly honest, I know there was a lot of chapters in the Thousand Years Tale, but I really enjoyed reading every section. But I was talking to a lot of people that they said that that was their number one gripe with the game. I had no problems because it did provide a lot of backstory on Kime without spending sort of like too much in the way of development. It would have taken them way longer if they would have published all those tales and cutscenes. So this was kind of a way Mistwalker can tell Kime's backstory without developing too much into it, and I really enjoyed it. It was kind of different than most RPGs, and I was more than willing to read everything. But getting into the more into the story, Kime, of course, is supported with some other fantastic characters like Seth, who is another immortal. You know, he finds on his journey very early on. And of course, one of my favorite characters in an RPG, which goes by the name of Jensen. And if you want to know who Jensen is, he's the comic relief of Lost Odyssey. Nearly everything that comes out of his mouth was on the floor in stitches. Just to give, just to give you a little taste, when you're preparing for one of the ventures and the characters are waiting for Jensen, he comes out of a bar with, I'd like to say, very politely, three courtesans, having a good merry time, and he's kind of drunk off his ass. And you, if you want to see the charm of Lost Odyssey, just kind of watch that on YouTube. You will just absolutely laugh your ass off. And that's the one thing I really liked about Lost Odyssey is they had those moments where it was such a dramatic story, and it was so good of Jensen to provide some light humor here and there. You know, it kind of really just blended nicely. So I don't want to give too much away in the story. The one thing I will touch upon before I move into the mechanics of the game is the character of Gongora, which I believe to be one of the best villains ever in a video game. He is so ruthless. He's an absolute, conniving puppeteer. And Nobuo Uematsu kind of provided this wonderful theme that plays with him, that kind of gives him more character, makes him more mysterious and mischievous. And he was one of the most memorable villains in a very long time for me. So that's probably one of the other reasons I kind of took to Lost Odyssey very, very well. And just quite notably, I want to say that there is a few scenes in that game that's very, I'd say, tear-jerking, especially one part in the game, but I won't spoil that, but I just thought I'd warn you ahead of time. You all encountered it, and I've talked to other people that have said that they have cried when they've witnessed that part of the game because it's so powerful and emotional. And that's what Lost Odyssey does. Like all the great RPGs before it, it just invokes every emotion you can possibly think of, whether you're sad, whether you're laughing, whether you're happy, whether you're envious, everything. And there's not many games that do that these days. So I give big props to Lost Odyssey and its amazing story for doing that for me and a lot of other gamers. So just before I go into the battle mechanics, I just want to say, Arrow, what did you think of the game's story?
The story at that time, back in 2008 when I picked it up, it just blew me away. And you earlier mentioned, you had that feeling, yes, we're moving into the at that time next generation of RPG gaming, and that's the exact feeling that I had. The story as well, it just absolutely blew me away. The characters were very memorable. I found that the storyline mechanics, with the immortals and their rich history of thousand years that got told by the dreams, that was very interesting as well. And over the course, of 4 discs, that yes, even on a 360, it was a game with 4 discs. There was a fantastic story to be told, and I absolutely loved all the characters, especially later characters in the game. And indeed, Jensen is hilarious in a good way, which I know a lot of RPGs have comic relief, which is just sort of annoying. And Gongora indeed was a very, very evil puppeteer. But I absolutely love the story, but even more the gameplay, which you are going to tell us all about.
Okay, the gameplay of Lost Odyssey is a traditional turn-based RPG. There is no time bar. You can take your time with choosing your commands. But once you've chosen your command, if you've played a game like Legend of Dragoon, there is a meter where there's this sphere sort of, this circle meter, and as the character is running towards the target, you have to press the R button in time for when it meets with the circle, and depending on your accuracy, it may give you bonus damage. So that was one thing a lot of people kind of found very hard. I know in the first couple of hours I really struggled to get it right, but eventually as the game goes on, you just find the right time, and it's really good. And it did provide a lot of bonus damage, so it rewarded players for being quick on the button. Well, not really quick on the button, but accurate on the button, I should say. It's very, like I said, it's very traditional. It had its own set of spells that did kind of mimic Final Fantasy for a lot of people. I played a lot of RPGs where they'll have the 3 levels of magic, and Lost Odyssey is no exception, and there's nothing wrong with it. I really like it. They did have this very technical sort of positioning system that you can position certain characters in certain parts of the battlefield. And of course, it provided bigger defense if you're in the back road and more offense if you're on the front more than ever. And it was one of those RPGs where it was very prominent that the weaker defense characters would have also, of course, be put in the back. And I just thought Lost Odyssey sort of does what other RPGs does in that regards very, very well. Um, in terms of like walking, of course, the environments are very beautiful. It's like I said, the visuals is probably one of the best I've ever seen in an RPG. And I was always looking forward to going to that next area and exploring. And of course, it provides some extra places if you need to grind. I know there's an island where there's creatures that they're kind of like metal slimes from Dragon Quest. They run from battle, but if you can kill them, they give you a gargantuan amount of EXP, which I, of course, always enjoy if RPGs provide that mercy for its players. But one thing I do want to touch upon is it's actually quite hard. To begin with the game, I've actually played a string of RPGs before then, where I kind of just whiz through them and without either dying, or getting any game overs. But Lost Odyssey was one of the first games in a long time to kind of kick my ass, and it was a good thing. But not just the normal battles, but mainly the boss battles. It had some really tough, fantastically epic boss battles from the get go, and you did have to invest some time in beefing up your characters to prepare yourself for those fights. But in ultimate hindsight, it was absolutely worth it. So to be honest, it's a very traditional battle system, but of course it's just got that little bit of button pressing to give a bonus damage. So, Arrow, what's your thoughts on the battle system and just the gameplay in general?
Yeah, the gameplay is really really solid. Especially turn-based RPGs. I always loved back from Final Fantasy VIII. Where Squall could hit the R1 button to get extra bonus damage. Absolutely love that system. One thing that you forgot to mention is, of course, if you get specific rings and you improve on those rings, you were able to do that interruption more frequently. You know, you had more easier of accuracy. So that's another great integration in the equipment system, which again, the equipment system felt really awesome as it's used the same system as Final Fantasy IX, where you have these weapons and equipment that you could equip to specific characters, and they learn abilities based on ability points. And they, after you learn that, you know you had that ability, and you were able to, with a specific set of points, you could choose between all those abilities. You know, buffing up your character, you know, more damage spells, more MP, stuff like that, which makes for a very rich system of gameplay and such. And the gameplay was really awesome. The game indeed was very difficult, especially at the first disc, where several boss fights really kicked my ass at some point. But I have to be honest, that island that you mentioned, I spent a lot of hours grinding on Numara Atoll, uh, and I got really powerful at that point, where indeed the only thing that was able to kick my ass were the special bosses and of course the normal boss fights through the game. But with very diligent, skill learning, and if you have a choice to switch up a new ability, you know, that's how I play the RPGs. You know, once I learn an ability, instantly swap in. You know, I can evenly equip, you know, worse equipment, but to be able to learn new abilities, you know, which of course at that time tied into getting new achievements as well, made my party really strong, very diverse, you know, even though most of the characters have their own skill set of magic, warrior, and thief and such. But overall, the gameplay, absolutely fantastic. Graphics, even better. It's still one of the best looking RPGs on the 360. And I just loved Lost Odyssey so much. It was my favorite game on the Xbox 360 until I played Tales of Vesperia. But yeah, just overall, absolutely fantastic.
All right, just I want to go on the limb and say to all you RPG fans that Lost Odyssey is my favorite Xbox 360 game and was my favorite RPG of that year it was released, and I hold it in the highest regards. And if you have not bought it yet, do yourself a favor and go out and buy it. I paid full price for my original copy, but when I got rid of my 360 and that version, I actually that was one of the only games I really regretted giving away because I really wanted to play it again. So just one little tale I just want to touch upon before we move on is I found uh, Lost Odyssey a year ago. I actually gave my initial copy away, and I kind of regretted doing so. But I found a pristine copy of Lost Odyssey for $15 in a going out of business sale. So I definitely yanked that out and paid my $15 with glee, and it's been sitting on my shelf unopened. But I'm hoping for the day when I get a new 360 that I'll be able to unwrap it and um, basically lose myself once more in Lost Odyssey.
All right. Yeah, that's definitely awesome. You know, luckily I've never been able or never had to, you know, sell off games, but I know I have sold some games at some point that I regret doing. But luckily you have found the game again. Hopefully you'll be able to get the new system, and who knows, you know, maybe the new Xbox will have backwards compatibility. But that's a whole different story. So that's Lost Odyssey. Definitely a very awesome RPG. And that basically rounds out, you know, the Microsoft Xbox 360 deal that they had. Of course, I already mentioned uh, Blue Dragon Plus and Blue Dragon Awakened Dragon, but there are more games of Mistwalker, and of course their recent title, The Last Story. But we'll have to wait until Greg tells us all about it. Until I briefly mention, of course, several other games. Now, there have been three different games from Mistwalker Studios, and first of all is one that I really regret not being released in the European and Western regions, and that is Ash Archaic Sealed Heat. And this is a tactical or strategy RPG on the Nintendo DS. And just take a look at the box art, absolutely fantastic box art. And I do own a copy of the game that I recently picked up from Yahoo Auction Japan. And I gave the game a quick try, and it's definitely a very interesting strategy RPG. It's kind of hard to explain. It's basically a strategy RPG that feels very similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, and especially the soundtrack feels really reminiscent of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, and that's definitely very interesting. And this time around, Nobuo Uematsu didn't do the music for Ash Archaic Sealed Heat, but of course Hitoshi Sakimoto was the composer, which is of course the composer of Final Fantasy Tactics, hence the similarities. Another very interesting thing about Ash is, even though it's a tactical RPG, you basically on the grid you move your characters around enemies, but at that same time, you get into the turn-based aspect, which is something I have so far only seen in Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor, where you indeed move into a turn-based perspective, select your abilities, select your attacks and stuff like that, and it basically plays out. Now, one minor gripe that I had with Ash is that it, despite not being in English, of course, is that it is pretty slow paced. Battles move around the screen, very slow. The transition and such makes it for a very slow based gameplay, and of course, with not the most time that I have currently, uh, is a little bit disappointing. But of course, this game is not in English, so I just gave it a try. There was a lot of rumor that Archaic Sealed Heat would have been released in Europe. Sadly, it did not, which is definitely very disappointing to see, But it's a very interesting game from Mistwalker, and again ties into, sort of all bases covered. They have turn-based RPGs, and now they also have a strategy RPG, and they have action RPGs. But yeah, I really enjoyed Ash from what I've played so far, and who knows, maybe some fan translators out there will get their hands and make it into full English. But Greg, you're a big fan of tactical RPGs. How does Ash sound to you?
Well, actually, when I found out it was made by Mistwalker, I always try and find as much information on the game, watch all the trailers, and I really like the art style of Ash and the characters and the fact it's got a female lead. I'm actually a big fan of female leads in RPGs, which is goes back to me starting off with Fantasy Star. So I was very interested. One of the things I did like is the graphics kind of uses a render. So it's not full 3D polygons, it's more of a render. And I'm actually a big fan of that type of graphics. So yeah, think Donkey Kong Country. That's kind of one of my favorite types of visuals. And it does have that. And like Ero said, is it's a strategy RPG, but once your character gets in contact with the enemy, it becomes a turn-based RPG. And of course, like you said as well, it that reminds me a bit of Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor. So I really can't wait to get a copy. I think I've seen it for reasonably cheap here and there. I just really don't have the time for it right now because I've got plenty of RPGs, but it's definitely on my list. I'm actually kind of regret that it didn't come out in English. I can kind of understand if it was really slow paced, but um, I would have to check it for myself and judge it before I can talk any more about it. But it does interest me, and I can't wait to have it a part of my DS collection.
All right. Yeah, I hope that at some point I will be able to play more. Let's talk a little bit more about the games from Mistwalker. And the game that I'm going to talk about is a game that I only found out, through internet. I have not seen anything on it, and that is surprisingly a game called Away Shuffle Dungeon, which is again an action RPG made by Mistwalker and co-developed with a different company that I'll get into in a second. And basically, the main focus, is shovel dungeons. It's really hard and, of course, hard for me to describe, but basically, it's a Nintendo DS title where both screens show a part of the dungeon and you're able to explore it. And when a player enters the dungeons, they have some specific abilities and they're able to get bonus content. The thing with Away, though, is that it did get a localization back in 2008 or 2009, and I have to say that I have never seen this game in the wild. And because it boasts a huge Majesco logo on the front, I did not know this was a Mistwalker until I did research for this episode. So I can definitely say that I'm very interested in Away. It is an action RPG, and I've definitely. It sounds like a roguelike RPG, which is something that I really want to get into more often, because it's probably the least explored type of RPGs. And I'm definitely going to see and track down if I can find a copy of Away Shuffle Dungeon. Again, Nobuo Uematsu did the wonderful soundtrack, so that's always a plus. How does this sound to you, Greg?
It's very funny. I just completely went off my radar. I completely forgot about it until you just brought it up. So, oh, I'm gonna have to look into it a bit more. But it totally just went past my head. I completely forgot about it. So I really got nothing to add to it, except for what you just informed about it. So, but of course, even the hosts of Rpgibberish can be informed about new games. So, you know, it works. What can I say?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's definitely true. We don't know everything, and I was definitely surprised, to see that there was even more Mistwalker games out there. Speaking of Mistwalker, of course, for a very long time they had a title called Cry On in development, which sadly got cancelled. The thing with Cry On, it was another supposed to be another RPG on the 360, which was in co-development with Kavia Studios, known from Drakengard and Nier. Um, we don't know the real reasons behind the cancellation. It's probably due to the Japanese gaming economy for the last couple of years, but definitely very interesting to see. But Cryon was definitely not the last title from Mistwalker, because, of course, there was the last story. So please, Greg, tell us everything about last story and why we should be interested in the title.
Okay, RPG fans. The last story is Mistwalker's latest RPG that was released on the Wii. And basically, from what I've seen of it, it looks absolutely fantastic. Just to give you a small rundown, apparently, what the game is about is the main character, whose name is Elza, was basically lost his family as a child, and he basically works with a mercenary group, um, and they've pretty much become a family. And I can't really get too much in the specifics because, unfortunately, as I already said, I don't know Japanese and I can't understand most of it. But from what I've seen of the game so far, like Lost Odyssey, it looks fantastic. Um, I wish this game was released earlier because the Wii could have used an RPG like this. The graphics are absolutely beautiful. The One of the artists, of course, is Kimihiko Fujisaka, which is a mangaka, does really good artwork. Really, of course, the soundtrack is also done by Nobuo Uematsu, and I can say this from listening to the OST, it's definitely one of his best works, along with Lost Odyssey and the PlayStation Final Fantasy games. And I, I just want to give you a heads up. The final battle theme is unlike anything I've ever heard in a game. It is incredibly bizarre, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what takes place in the final battle to to see why Nobuo Uematsu picked that piece of music to represent it because I'm very interested. Usually I don't spoil soundtracks, but I was really excited for the last story. I thought I'd listen to it. Basically, what was really cool was I got to witness a 2 hour press conference a month before the game was released. And basically, Hironobu Sakaguchi came on stage and showed a demo of the game. And he showed himself playing it and he narrated what to do. It was a really fantastic presentation, and I was very lucky to watch that on Ustream. Basically, it showed off the gameplay, which I'm very interested in. The last story is a action RPG, a party-based action RPG, kind of reminiscent of Fantasy Star Online, but a lot more faster and a lot more intricate. Because what I really, really like about the last story from what I've seen, they give you many different ways to play the game. Basically, you have the choice of course, rushing in all guns bared, but what I find interesting is before you go into the room, just as you entered it, you can actually have the option of looking at the room or the battlefield before you engage the enemy. So it gives you that time you need to plan your attack, and I really like that. I like the fact that they've given the game a bit more strategic feel, like you don't have to rush into battles. And most of all, and I find this really, really cool, being a Metal Gear Solid fan, the game also rewards you for being stealthy. There'll be times where you will need to use one of your characters will have to go out of the pack. You control that character, and you can actually basically hug walls and you can crouch between covers. And what happens is if you can get behind the enemy without the enemy noticing you, you get bonus critical damage. So the game rewards you for being stealthy, which I really like. And then to add on to that, there's also a third person mode, shooting mode, where the character has a crossbow. It's sort of kind of like Resident Evil in a way, with its aiming, the later Resident Evil games, and you can basically pot enemies from afar and do many things. One of the funniest things that I saw my friend Taylor of the Murogaru 553 channel, he basically showed us that you can load the crossbow with banana peels and you can make enemies and people trip over in the streets, which I always found amusing. But I just like how they've invented this game with so many different play styles. You know, it'll cater to a lot of different gamers, and I think it's a home run. Uh, just to get a little bit more into it, talking about the character of Elza, he has these mystical powers, and one of them is the power to attract enemies, where he basically sort of grabs them by a magical rope and pulls them along. What's really cool is the demonstration I saw is this pretty much gives your other characters time to cast magic or to basically turn around, come behind the enemy, and stab in the back to do even more damage. So, for being an action RPG, is extremely, extremely strategic, and I'm really looking forward to playing because I love strategy RPGs and I like planning ahead, and getting the best possible outcome, and just the feeling of just planning something ahead and just getting it right and winning the battle. It's just a good feeling. And of course, I'm guessing that it will be very challenging, so there'll be fights later on where you need to rethink your plans over and over. But I like that about RPG, so I'm really looking forward to it. Just some little hints I find really interesting about the game is any pieces of equipment that you buy or find for the character completely changes their appearance, which I find really cool. So if you're into that, like if you're a big fan of Dragon Quest IX and like how your characters change, then you'll be very, very much looking forward to the last story. And that's pretty much it. Arrow, have you seen or read anything about the last story?
Honestly, I know about the game's existence, of course, and that I really want to play it. That's from Mistwalker, but I had not seen any video besides some few screenshots. But listening to you, how you are describing the gameplay and the stealth and the bonuses, and just listening to it, it just really sounds like a fantastic, fantastic action RPG that I really can't wait to get my hands on. Just being stealthy, of course, I'm a big fan of Metal Gear Solid. That's always very nice. Especially the different play styles. That's something that you don't see a lot in Japanese RPGs. I know if we take a look at Western RPGs, take a look at Mass Effect, for instance, you are able to build up your character in different ways and can basically play through the game, completely different. And I think that the last story perhaps is perhaps kind of took a good look at Western RPGs and kind of built it around that. You've definitely interested me way more, in terms of the Operation Rainfall games. I'd only seen the bits of Xenoblade, and I've also never seen anything on Pandora's Tower. But it definitely interested me, and I just can't wait. Let's hope that this game is getting a localization, at least in English. It doesn't matter what region. I'm sure I'll be able to import and play it. But that sounds really good, and I just describing it, that feels like the last story is definitely a huge hit, and let's hope you're able to play.
Yes, well, with the news, of course, it was very barren for the first half of the year, and there was just little rumors. Of course, the biggest one of all was the project manager of the French branch of Nintendo kind of said that they were looking into localizing it. Um, so I think it will come out in PAL at least. There hasn't been any announcements for America yet. There's also rumors surrounding that's release, whether Nintendo's withholding the game or just waiting until they believe they have the right audience to, or the right number. Because I don't want to get into this episode what basically has happened surrounding the creation of Operation Rainfall. I know they're very passionate fans. They're very awesome. I've spoken to some on the Facebook page, and I've always check out their YouTube channel. And they just make me very proud to be a gamer that basically a group of individuals can sort of campaign for something they want, even though it hasn't been, translated in English yet. They just want it so much, and they believe in the games to warrant release worldwide. Of course, the first game of Operation Rainfall, which is Xenoblade, has officially it was announced, and it's actually very, very close to being released. And I've actually seen pictures and screenshots and all that, but that's for another podcast. But from what I can say about what I've seen of Xenoblade's English translation, it's gorgeous. And I think they did a fantastic job. I can't wait to get my hands on it. I've actually already pre-ordered it, and it's going to be coming in about 19 days, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. I've already pre-ordered my copy as well. I can't wait for Xenoblade Chronicles, even though it has nothing to do, with Mistwalker. I'm very psyched for that game, and I'm sure that we both will play it, and we'll definitely delve into Xenoblade for an entire episode, probably tied together, with the Great Monolith Soft. But I am very psyched for Xenoblade Chronicles, and let's hope we can say the same for the last story later on, perhaps early 2012. But I just hope that the game gets an announcement.
Before we close off the Mistwalker segment, I actually want to share a story with our listeners. As all of you might know, whoever subscribed to my channel, I took a break at near the start of the year to go on a trip to Sydney to visit Nobuo Uematsu in the Distant Worlds concert. It was absolutely fantastic. I had the time of my life. It's one of the highlights of my life, definitely. And I got to meet the man after the concert, which was very surreal. And I took my copy of Final Fantasy VII, got him to sign, and I had a bit of a chat to him. But the one question that I said to him, I said, I can't wait to listen to the soundtrack of the last story and play the game. And he basically was very shocked that an Australian knew about the existence of the last story, but then had a very downtrodden look on his face. And then he turned to his translator and said something in Japanese. And the translator turned to me and said, I don't think the last story is getting a release. And I didn't want to look depressed, so I turned around and said, well, we're the gamers of the world's fighting for it. And I kind of believe that that's the truth, because this is before Operation Rainfall existed. So um, I always put the gaming industry in a very positive light. I always like to say that we're all fighters, and if we desire something, we'll fight for it. Yeah, with kindness, of course. I don't, I don't advise you to do extremes. Of course, negotiate with whoever company might be interested, and just tell who might be interested in it. Well, that's what Operation Rainfall is doing now, and I reckon they're doing a splendid job. They're just cornering every possible media, whether it's be YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. And I know that the one of the founders always goes on podcasts, so they're one of the best campaigns I've ever come across. But yeah, I'm basically getting back into that. But it's just very interesting that that happened, because I had no idea that this would happen. But at the same time, I knew there was going to be a fan base that would fight for the game. So I'm guessing that if he's listening, which I doubt, but I like to dream. Or if he reads the news, I guess he'd be much more happier that his music will reach a wider audience eventually.
All right, yeah, that's very interesting story. Yeah, I'm of course very jealous of you meeting Uematsu, but very interesting to see him commenting on last story probably not getting a release. It must be hard for the creators, the artists behind the game to get their as much influence as possible in the entire world, but they don't control that aspect as well. It's all up to marketing and a big part of Nintendo, of course. But let's hope let's hope that it gets released worldwide, and people can enjoy both the music as well as the fantastic game that Mistwalker worked very very hard on to bring us a fantastic RPG, and it sounds really great, judging from what you've told me.
Oh, it is. It's definitely one of the most awaited games, and I can't wait till 2012 when I'll be able to play it.
Alright, I think that about wraps it up for Mistwalker. Of course, we've been talking about the history of the games, all the games in general, and they definitely have a fantastic library with a lot of unknown games as well. But how about the future of Mistwalker? Of course, they have been recently released last story, and there's a lot of debate going on whether it gets a Western release. But of course, as a company, they have to move forward, and details are very scarce, on Mistwalker. I've been following their Twitter account, etc., and follow a lot of websites that delve really into development. But there's not really anything out there currently on Mistwalker. There are some hints that they are working on a new project. No idea what system or what type of game it is. So we'll have to wait and see. For a couple of years now, there's been rumor that they are also working on an iPhone or a iOS game, but again, no details whatsoever. But Mistwalker, it's been around for only a couple of years, 7 years, and I am sure that we will see many more fantastic RPGs. That I am very sure. See more creative games released by Sakaguchi and Uematsu and the team behind it. The question, of course, remains: will these games be localized in English as well? I think that's the most important question. As besides to will there be more Mistwalker games? For that, I'm sure there will be. So I think that's about it from Mistwalker. One thing that I want to contribute it to the entire story is Mistwalker is a company that has a small team on its own, but they work together with a lot of great companies. And if you kind of put those companies, in a grid, you see a lot of similarities, beside all the different companies that work together more closely than you might think. So we have Mistwalker, and they basically work together with a lot of other companies. Like I mentioned a couple of times, they work with Brownie Brown, known for the Mother series. They also work a lot with Rtoon, as well as Feel Plus, and those companies were basically put up by Microsoft, to help out Mistwalker and develop their games. Now, interesting thing, with Rtoon and Feel Plus is that they are both part of AQ Interactive, which is kind of the mother company above it, which also includes Xseed for all companies. So that's basically all three companies, part of the AQ Interactive. And there's a huge set of games, of course. Now, we have Xseed as the localization branch, and then we have Rtoon and Feel Plus. But for instance, Feel Plus is not really that known, perhaps, but they, for instance, have developed, Lost Odyssey, but also Star Ocean: The Last Hope, Infinite Undiscovery, recently Mind Jack, which of course are all games again once published by Square Enix. And the same goes for Tri Crescendo, which has also done a lot of work on Blue Dragon, and they made Eternal Sonata and the Baden Kaido series, which again was co-developed with Monolith Soft. And as you can see, I can just talk about this for an hour, but it's not just Mistwalker. They have an entire branch of companies which ties back into Square and all different companies. So it's not per se, all competitive work out there that's being done. It's all these companies just having their talents. People from different departments. Music, art, all collaborating together to make fantastic creative RPGs or different games, and it's more woven in together than you might think. And after doing some research, I was really surprised to see all these different companies together, which definitely makes for very interesting research. But how do you feel about this, Greg? All these different companies woven in, and especially Xseed. That was what surprised me the most.
Yeah, well, gaming is a business, and basically, I've always said that to the developers, gaming is an investment. Of course, to us, it's a game; it's our source of entertainment. To the people that work on it, it's their job, it's their career, and to the people that put behind money behind it, it's an investment. And they like to basically know where their money is going to be used wisely and of course going to produce more. It's very interesting to see AQ in that great spans, with all those companies, especially Xseed. You know, I'm guessing they would be very proud of that because Xseed has done a wonderful job localizing all these wonderful RPGs in the but doing to the States, and they've done a wonderful job, especially me being the biggest Falcom fan on the net. I'm very thankful for them to bring out the series and the Sora no Koseki series. I should say Trails in the Sky to not confuse any of you, but I'm very happy, man. But yeah, I learned about Feel Plus, and it's tied. Basically, the cruise ties to Shadow Hearts. So a lot of people kind of commented on sort of the art style, sort of reminiscent of Shadow Hearts in certain aspects. But I could fully understand it. Microsoft wants to get the best out of those games, so they wanted to be reassured. So they got Feel Plus, of course, to work with Mistwalker behind Lost Odyssey. Basically, whatever you need to do to bring the game out in the best form possible, yeah, I welcome it. I'm not one of those gamers who are very impatient and always rants and rages if a game doesn't come out on time. If there is a problem with the game, I would like the developer to take as much time as humanly possible to fix any problem that arises, because I've played a lot of RPGs in this age that suffer from tremendous bugs, and not just tiny bugs. A game we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about the Artillery series. But very quickly, I had a bug that prevented me from finishing the game. Now, whether that was a fault in the PAL version, I don't know, but just I'm very, very eminent about quality control. So I'm guessing, just getting back, I'm very happy that they got all these developers to work together because to make the best possible game with no faults. So, you know, I will welcome it, honestly.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can definitely agree with those words. Let's just take as much time as possible, and it's definitely an investment for the developers. So yeah, I think that about wraps up the entire look at Mistwalker. I definitely hope that everybody out there got to know the company, all the different games out there, and we shared our stories about our experiences with it, and let's all be very psyched and excited for Last Story. Now that pretty much is the first part of the podcast, of course, but you guys are all wondering, of course, how is it going with the weekly challenge and what have we been playing. So for those everybody interested in Mistwalker, this is the first part of the podcast, and we'll now move on into the bonus round where we'll be talking about the weekly challenge, and I will give it to Greg to talk about the game Mother 1. And there are more developers, from the Square era, so it's really hard for Mistwalker to kind of lose themselves of that Square stigma. Several people have also called them, just copying, but that's really hard to do. I feel honestly that the Mistwalker games are indeed very similar to Final Fantasy, especially Lost Odyssey. And if you look at the title of course, their Wii title, the last story, kind of ties into Final Fantasy. I personally really don't mind the games being similar to the series that I love the most. I don't know, Greg, how do you feel about Mistwalker stigma, towards Square?
I don't look at it too much, but what I basically how I came into Mistwalker was it has to do with my extreme dislike of Final Fantasy X-2. I hated their game so much. I kind of researched into things to know what went wrong, and found out that most of the key figures did not work on that game, and they left around that time. So I thought to myself, I wanted to play the next big adventure after FF10, which I really loved actually, and I found out that they started this company. So I kind of put two and two together. I was wondering if they were going to kind of touch
Of Japanese companies, especially RPG companies, to start on working on games, exclusive games for the Xbox and the upcoming Xbox 360. So with a lot of financial backing from Microsoft, Hironobu Sakaguchi and several others were able to found Mistwalker and start developing games exclusively for the 360, which in the earlier years led to two fantastic titles we'll talk in a second. But eventually, Microsoft lost their exclusivity, and Mistwalker has been developing a lot of different games. As of now, they have released three major titles that have or are going to be released in the European and North American regions as well. And they definitely made a lot of handheld games as well, specifically the Nintendo DS, where they usually outsourced or co-developed with several other companies, which we'll talk about later on. So that's pretty much the history of Mistwalker. Not a lot of great games, but in the last 7 years, they've made some very interesting RPGs. Of course, it is very hard for them to lose the face, of being a Square company. We have Hironobu Sakaguchi. In terms of the musical department, they asked Nobuo Uematsu himself to make the wonderful soundtracks to the games. And welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the second episode of Rpgibberish. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for listening to the first episode and responding with comments and leaving feedback. We're very grateful for that, and we'll definitely work in all the tips that you've been giving us. But for now, we are moving on to the second episode, and in this episode we are going to be talking about another fantastic RPG company, and that is Mistwalker. Mistwalker is of course a fantastic company that kind of spawned off from a lot of the creators of the Final Fantasy and Squaresoft era. But we'll talk about that in a second. First of all, Greg, how have you been doing?
How you going, Nero? I've been doing very well. I've actually been busy lately with my channels. I recently hit 600 subscribers with my RPG Swagman channel, and I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you to all my subscribers. It's been an awesome year since September of last year. I've met a lot of new friends and talked to a lot of great gamers. So I'd like to say thank you so much. And I opened a new channel, which is under the name of Kojima Collector, where I talk about Metal Gear Solid and other games that Hideo Kojima has made, which is really cool. And pretty much, I haven't been gaming a lot lately. I'll get into that later in the podcast. How about you? How have you been doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fine, and I definitely want to mention for everybody out there, definitely check out Kojima Collect Time I have playing there. I can get a lot of RPG time going, which we'll of course talk about later on with the weekly challenge. So yeah, I think it's time to start. On the Mistwalker segment. And as we've mentioned before in the first episode of Rpgibberish, we take a specific series or a specific company and we just discuss the entire history, how we like the games, future of the company, etc. And for this episode, it's Mistwalker. So I'm going to be starting off, talking a little bit about Mistwalker itself. Now, Mistwalker was founded back in 2004. Officially, it's called Mistwalker Corporation. And the studio was founded by, of course, the one and only Hironobu Sakaguchi, which is, of course, the creator of the Final Fantasy series. At some point, Enix took over Square, and there were a lot of key figures not very happy with their position. And most notably, of course, Hironobu Sakaguchi, who at that time lost a lot of face at Square for the failure of the animated movie Spirits Within. He kind of loosened himself from Square and moved on to Mistwalker. And the thing with Mistwalker is Microsoft was looking for a lot of. Greg has made a couple of great videos talking about Metal Gear Solid and Kojima. I'm a big fan, of course, as well, so I had to subscribe to that. But yeah, I've been doing very well. One minor thing, I started a new job assignment, which allows me to travel a very long time. But with my PSP, I've been playing a lot of RPGs, pretty much 3 hours a day.
Oh, that's good. Well, I'm glad that I'm glad for the existence of the PSP because that's probably what it was kind of made for. I hear so many stories of Japanese businessmen on those trains and bullet trains just with their PSP. I just reckon it's the DS and the PSP are just two of the most superb handhelds out there. That kind of they are it can be played by any gamer depending on where you are. Of course, there's the different games for each system that sort of complements to play it on the run or to crash on your couch or merge into your bed. Just a great selection of titles, and I often actually play my PSP on the bus, and I know the feeling of playing on the run. It's very daunting at first, but you kind of get used to it, especially if you've got a busy job and you just need as much time as you could possibly can to play a game.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can definitely use that time. Making 55 to 60 hour shifts, but with the travel time and the